Nice to virtually sort of see you all. Well, not literally see you all, but to be in the same space. I'm just to say I'm representing a whole team of people based across a few institutions. So just a big thanks to the team and the funder, the NIHR in the UK. Um, so the sort of main problem that this intervention that I'll be talking about was seeking to address is basically a very under-investigated aspect of smoking and trying to quit smoking. One of the main reasons why people fail to quit smoking is through urges to smoke. I think that's pretty well established. So people get an urge and then they smoke, and that relieves that urge for a period of time. Urges are caused by two main factors. So they can be caused by low blood nicotine levels, and a relatively sort of straightforward intervention is to provide a replacement of that nicotine. So things like nicotine replacement therapy is a good way of addressing urges driven by low blood nicotine levels, and helps people to get through sort of withdrawal period. But there's a second cause of urges to smoke, which most commonly used medications don't address. Things like nicotine replacement therapy and drugs like varenicline are not very good at addressing cue-based urges or cue-induced cravings or urges. And these are due to triggers that people experience in their environment. They could be the presence of other smokers. That's quite a common one. It could be rapid changes in mood, and this can be sort of positive mood and negative mood, but also other sort of features of the environment that people have over time been in or been doing, like drinking alcohol or drinking coffee, which is then associated with the reward that's provided by smoking. So the more people smoke in, say, when they're drinking, or if they're at the bus stop or wherever, the stronger the cue and the urges they'll get from that cue when they spend time there and they're not smoking. And this is largely an unaddressed issue. Just to say that vaping is a way of addressing these. And vaping is a less harmful approach than smoking in terms of disease risk. But if someone's then trying to quit vaping, they're likely to encounter the same kind of issues, that they'll find certain places trigger urges to smoke through through the way in which nicotine provides reward. So just a couple of things that's of interest to this kind of scenario. One of which is that so when someone's trying to quit smoking, around half of lapses, so people who smoke during a quit attempt but don't fully return to smoking, half of these are due to these triggers in the environment that lead to urges and lead people to smoke. So cue-induced cravings are a really important part of explaining why people smoke early in a quit attempt in particular. And when people do smoke early in a quit attempt, they're much less likely to be successful in quitting. So there's been some really interesting work looking at how people who smoke in the first week or couple of weeks of a quit attempt are much, much more likely, even though they might kind of get back to abstinence after that, they're still much, much more likely to fail when followed up at 6 months and long-term follow-up. And that's been supported by experimental evidence as well, inducing people to smoke. You find the same sort of thing. People who are randomized to be induced to smoke versus not during a quit attempt, those who are induced to smoke are much more likely to have relapsed when followed up. The other interesting thing, I think, about this whole scenario is that the time it takes for someone who is trying to quit smoking between when a cue-induced craving or urge occurs and when they smoke. So we don't have great amounts of data on this, but there's one really interesting study by Saul Schiffman and colleagues showing that on average, that period of time between the urge onset and them smoking is something around, on average, around 11 minutes. And it's obviously going to vary depending on circumstance and individual. But That suggests that there's a pretty narrow window of opportunity, perhaps, to sort of intervene at that point. Can we do something within those 11 minutes? And that raises the question, how might we know if someone's likely to experience a cue-induced craving so that we can try and get close to that time frame where we can help people and stop them just kind of going and sort of picking a cigarette out of the packet. So this is kind of where QuitSense came from, really trying to address this in the moment need for support. So I'm just going to talk through how QuitSense works and then kind of move on to the evaluation that we've done. So QuitSense is a smartphone app, and basically people set a quit date as part of the onboarding process. And the only thing they're asked to do is that every time they smoke leading up to that quit date, and we suggest that people leave at least 5 days before their quit date, into the future, so that they have a bit of time to train the app. But every time that they smoke, they report smoking in the app, and that triggers an ecological momentary assessment survey that they complete. There's 5 questions there, and these questions ask about the strength of urges, their level of stress, their current low mood, the presence of others, and whether those others are smokers and who those others are, and what the current situation they're in, whether that's them at home, working from home, a social environment, whether they're in some other kind of context. And those seem to be some of the most important drivers of smoking behaviour, and that's why we've collected those particular ones. And what happens at the same time as answering those questions is the phone takes a location snapshot using location services on the phone to identify where that person is. And if they smoke more than once in that same area, then it'll create a geofence or a virtual perimeter around that area. So the phone essentially knows where your smoking areas are. And equally, by completing these surveys, it understands what the likely triggers are for that individual in that location, and what that location means to them. Is that their home? Is it a workplace, and so on? There's also additional information people can get from the app, like they can sort of see what the situations are and the likely cues are that are driving their behavior, so they can learn a bit about what the app thinks is main drivers of their behavior. And this is all considered to be part of stage 1, which is basically up until they start their quit attempt. And it could be up to 4 weeks, but realistically, it's more like 5 days or 7 days. So then when the quit date arrives, people go into stage 2, and the app kind of changes color, actually. And the sort of primary support that it provides in stage 2, which lasts for 4 weeks, is to provide in the moment support when people enter into these geofences. So, for example, here in this image, we've got a smaller circle representing an individual who enters into this wider circle, which represents the geofence, and that creates something called an entry event, where the app then thinks, okay, this person's entered in, this is their home, these are the drivers, and these are the sorts of messages and support that we'll deliver to them. So 5 minutes, or within 5 minutes of them entering into that area, there's an entry event message, which would be tailored to what their drivers are of smoking in that location. And then every 3 hours they spend in that area, there's a dwell event message that's delivered, and again tailored. It also tailors it to time of day to some extent. And there's also additional features within the app. There's daily messages that people get. They can there's self-monitoring opportunities where they can track aspects of their smoking, how they're feeling, their cravings level. There's a library of information support, and end-of-day surveys as well that people can complete or not complete, up to them. And the end-of-day surveys populates that tracking calendar we saw on the previous slide. So this is like a 28-day or 4-week quitting challenge that people are asked to sort of engage with. And then by stage 3, which is after 4 weeks of quitting, the idea is to maintain that change, and this in-the-moment support starts to gradually reduce. It reduces by 50% every 4 weeks until it ends after 8 weeks. And the idea being that, it's hopefully starting to help people to manage environments where they might be cued or triggered to have a craving to smoke. And they've learned enough, hopefully, about those and how to avoid them and so on, that hopefully it will have helped. If it hasn't, it's probably not going to help by continuing on forever. So, there is an option if people do relapse, then and they report that in the app, then the app will kind of suggest, well, do you want to restart your quit attempt, have another go back to stage 1, or do you want to recommit and go back to stage 2 and kind of keep going, sort of thing. Okay, so that's hopefully a bit of an overview of the app and how it works. So we had done some feasibility work and done a couple of studies working to co-design this app with people and test it out, and just to see, will it trigger support and what do people think about this and so on. And we learned quite a lot and adapted the app according to what we learned from those studies. And then that led us to a feasibility trial, because we were very interested to do a large definitive trial, but we were conscious that it was important to answer some key questions before we proceeded to that. And so the feasibility trial had 4 main objectives, as listed here. They were partly around the parameters that we might need to inform the definitive trial, things like, response rates and costs. We were very keen to make sure that enough people had installed the app and engaged with it for it to be potentially effective. If not enough people install it or use it, then we'd have to sort of rethink how we do that for any future evaluation. We were interested in estimating what kind of effect quit sense might have as part of a sort of exploratory analysis, although the study wasn't powered to detect differences between our groups. It was based around precision for some of these key parameters, like completion of outcome measures. And then we're interested in what did people think of it and what was their experience of participating in the trial. So we published or made available ahead of time our protocol and our statistical and health economics analysis plan. I'm not going to talk about the health economics today, and I'm only going to talk about one aspect of the process evaluation as well. So in terms of design, it was a parallel to RCT, and it had a qualitative process evaluation, and we also did, as mentioned at the beginning, a study within a trial or a SWOT, looking at incentives on attrition. And I'll go on to talk about it in a moment, but the trial design that we were interested in doing was trying to automate as much as possible about the whole sort of trial process. And so some of these things, like incentives, were particularly interesting to us because they might reduce the amount of manual involvement that we would have for any future study. In terms of blinding, the research team were blinded, except for a few people: study statistician, who wasn't involved in any data collection, database developers, who also weren't involved, and then the lead researcher. It was impossible to keep them blind because they were doing follow-up and speaking to people and so on. But we did as much as possible. And participants weren't blind to allocation either. So, okay, this is kind of how the trial kind of looked. And we were recruiting, so this is a few years ago, and we're recruiting from Facebook and Google. And the way we worked with an external organization called Native, and they managed and set up the adverts for us. But once they sort of set it up, it was pretty much something that they just let run, and occasionally they assessed to see just how things were going. When they did first start it up, they tested quite a few different image and wording combinations to see which ones were driving the most amount of engagement and enrollment, and then we sort of stuck with those best ones as we then sort of continued the trial. What happened from the participants' perspective is that they might have seen an advert on Facebook or through Google search. If they clicked on the link in the advert, that would bring them to the study homepage, where they could read about the study, access the participant information sheet, and if they're interested in taking part, complete consent. They would then be given the baseline questionnaire to complete online. and would be randomized at that point to either one of two arms: the usual care arm, who received a text message link to the NHS smoke-free website. So this is basically the NHS's digital and other kinds of smoking cessation offers. It did include a link to on the ground stop smoking services, but it's primarily sort of promoting their app and some other kind of web-based resources to help people quit smoking. Or they were randomized to the Quit Sense arm, and they also received the same usual care kind of link to the NHS website, but they also got a text message giving them a link to the Quit Sense app, how to install it from this was only available in the Android Play Store for this study, and they were given a code that they would use when they installed the app and opened it up, so that we could track who had and hadn't installed the app. We did send a follow-up message to those people who hadn't installed it as a prompt to do so, and I'll report back on how successful that was. And then at 6 weeks, we did a follow-up. That's where we did some qualitative process evaluation interviews. And then at 6 months, which is final follow-up, we followed people up to see if they were smoking, what their smoking status was. For those people that had quit smoking, then we asked them to complete a saliva sample and send that to a lab for testing. And we were looking for the presence of metabolites of nicotine, primarily cotinine and anabazine. So just in terms of the automation, basically, you can see at the bottom, from the advertising all the way up to when we would start to collect data from people as part of follow-up, the whole process was completely automated and run by our RedCap service or web interface. So we didn't have to do anything. And it was quite remarkable that we did quite a lot of testing, and the clinical trials unit group were amazing at setting this up, but it worked brilliantly. And actually we genuinely didn't have to do anything, which was the first experience for me in a trial where you didn't actually have to spend a huge amount of your time trying to recruit people. It happened automatically. In fact, we had to switch on and off the recruitment because it was coming in too fast at one point. So that may not happen now. I think I think Facebook do a lot more advertising these days, so it may be that's sort of that was sort of the best hunting days for recruiting online. I don't know. We technically could have automated all the follow-up, apart from posting out that saliva test kit. But for those people that didn't respond to automated text prompts to complete follow-up questionnaires, then we did do manual follow-up. And in smoking cessation trials, it's really quite important to do that because the follow-up rates just aren't good enough, I think. But that was partly why we were interested in these, testing out whether incentives makes a difference for this. So this is just our trial flow. It felt right to have this as a slide for you guys as an audience. But we had about 1,200 people who actually landed on the study website from the advert, and that translated into around just over 300 who assessed themselves for eligibility and just over 200 who were randomized. The final randomization number was 209 after one post-randomization exclusion. And I've just put in there the follow-up rate overall was about 77% at 6 months, although for analysis, applying an intention to treat approach, we analysed everyone. So missing data was assumed as smoking. Who were the people who took part? Pretty typical for a smoking cessation trial, aged around 40. Pretty even in terms of sex, so about half were female. We had about a third who had the lowest socioeconomic status quintile. In the study, we were very much targeting at least a third of those to be from this group. We didn't quite make that, but we were close. Around just over 90% were of white ethnicity. We also targeted other than white ethnicity in our halfway through our trial in our adverts, and had some success in improving the proportion from other than white groups for that, and smoked around 15 a day. It's, again, fairly normal. So, okay, objective one, completion rates, not necessarily everyone's most interesting bit of data, but it's very important for sort of informing future work. We had 76% who told us their smoking status, which was, within our kind of expectations. However, we had a much poorer response rate in terms of saliva sample. So we only got 45% of people who returned a saliva sample, and actually only in total 39% were viable, because there was, I think, just one that we couldn't actually get a reliable reading from. In terms of cost for advertising spend, the total cost for what we essentially paid Facebook and Google was just over £1,000. That equated to around £6 per participant. When you add in the cost of the fees for running these campaigns with Native or Health Research, I can't remember, they've changed their name, but anyway, they were called Native when we did the study, then that ups the per participant cost for recruitment to £19 per participant. But actually, I think that's still very good value for money in the context of recruiting for trials. This is some more information about the recruitment costs. Again, it's not something everyone's interested in, but just to pull out a couple of things that I think might be of interest. Firstly, Facebook was much more successful than Google. So Google was quite expensive. Per participant advert costs was £30, not including native fees, versus £4 in Facebook. And we didn't get very many people through Google search. Overall, of those people who had the advert sort of appear on their screen somewhere, called an impression, not necessarily looking at it, but it's on the screen somewhere, or either on their phone or on their, other device. 1% of people who had it on their screen clicked on the advert, which I'm told is quite good in terms of click-through rate. And then we had, of those people that clicked on the advert, we had 11% of them who enrolled in the study. So that's about 1 in 10, 11%. So I believe from talking to people who know more about this than myself that ended up being quite good kind of rates. But I'd be interested to hear anyone else's experiences with that. In terms of uptake and engagement, those in the intervention arm, 75% installed the app. And we know that because we have this tracking code. And interestingly, the reminder that we sent people 3 days afterwards, if they hadn't installed it, we sent that to 28 people, and only one person actually installed it. As a result, of those 28 who hadn't installed it, only one then went on to install it. So my take from that is that this reminder wasn't very helpful. If people were going to install it, they'd do it off that first text message or not at all. Of those people that installed the app, around half of people engaged with it beyond their quit date. And of these people, their median app engagement duration was about 27 days. There were some people who engaged longer and engaged shorter, and the median is a better indicator of that distribution, as it wasn't normal. But I again think this is quite good. You do find particularly in studies where it's quite easy to take part, people could sign up online. It wasn't terribly difficult. That you'll often get people who near the point of having to quit, they kind of duck out. So it's not that unusual for a lot of people not to make it to their quit date. And so we were pretty pleased with this. It definitely showed that quite a lot of the sample were engaging in the app for a reasonable amount of time as well. So jumping to objective 3, looking at the estimating the effect of quit sense. So our primary outcome was people who had said that they'd quit smoking for 6 months. So basically from the beginning of enrollment, we give them a couple of weeks, and then for a whole 6-month period. And they're not allowed to smoke any more than 5 cigarettes in total. So they're allowed a couple of indiscretions, but no more than 5. And this is verified by this saliva sample. If we don't have this data, or if they didn't respond and return a saliva sample, then they're assumed to be smoking. So a missing equals smoking assumption, as I mentioned earlier. Interestingly, this ended up being quite a big relative difference, and it was actually statistically significant, which was of quite a big surprise. However, I think caution should be applied because we had this low saliva return rate, and it did look a bit imbalanced between arms, and so I think we should be cautious about interpreting this. The absolute difference between groups was around 9%. Bearing in mind this low saliva sample return rate, if we look again at the data, but only at the self-reported, so ignoring the saliva sample, which is what this graph represents here, interestingly, we find the same absolute difference between arms of about 9%, but because everyone's quit rates go up in both arms, because you know didn't require people to send back that saliva test kit. Then we find that the relative difference here is a bit smaller. It's not statistically significant, but probably more in line with what we would expect this intervention to do in terms of helping people to quit. So some encouraging findings that show a potential signal that the intervention can be may be effective. Oops. So just to introduce the auto process evaluation. So I mentioned I wasn't going to talk about the sort of the traditional process evaluation, but this actually came from a clinical trials unit adoption meeting, where one of the people in the meeting, a colleague, suggested or thought, had you thought about trying to collect people's views about the app and their experience of using it through the app itself, which we kind of termed an auto process evaluation, where people kind of do it themselves. So we created a feature where people could record their own voice and describe their experiences of using the app. One potential benefit of this is that this could have higher ecological validity. It's much more natural for people to do that in their everyday life. You don't have the slightly artificial experience of someone calling you to do an interview, which is, not quite the same thing. But interestingly, not that many people did this. So we only had 6 submissions of an audio recording out of 78 people. And you can sort of take from this what you want, but I took from this that the way in which we sort of facilitated this auto process evaluation, it's probably not really effective in this way. Maybe there's some ways we can sort of prompt and promote it in a better way. We did provide 3 prompts for people to encourage them to share some of their thoughts on some different things at different points in the process. So that's something to sort of work on further if we felt this has further potential. And people responded on the sorts of things we were kind of interested in hearing from them. So some app improvement suggestions and some issues or problems or limitations from when they used it. So actually the submissions we got were very useful. So just moving on to the SWOT. So as we probably all know, there's always a challenge with retention in trials, and this can compromise the science. It can create attrition bias, can affect our statistical power, which studies are often powered just for the power that you're going for, not more than that. And so it doesn't take much data loss to reduce that. And it can potentially improve validity and generalizability as well, particularly if you get, the more data you get, the more sort of valid and less problematic that missing data becomes. But what we find with smoking cessation studies that are done online or through sort of web formats is that loss is actually quite high. Generally, looking at a Cochrane review, the attrition rate ranged from 20 to 50%. Which can be problematic. And it's usually a bit higher in smoking cessation studies anyway, I think. Incentives do seem to improve retention, and particularly in sort of remote trials where there isn't so much interpersonal or any interpersonal communication. But we couldn't find any evidence about automated trials, and there's not a huge amount of evidence around smoking cessation trials and different incentives. So this is really what made us interested in this, led by my colleague Juliet High. So these were the objectives. In fact, they didn't actually get cash, so it's slight misrepresentation here. They got Amazon vouchers, but to the value of £10 or £20. And we were interested in, well, what difference does having 10 versus 20 make to the overall follow-up rate at 6 months, our final follow-up? What difference does it make to the proportion of participants who need us to manually follow them up and to telephone them and try and collect or prompt them to complete data by the telephone? And the speed of response of them completing that survey, whether by telephone or online, and then the completeness of responses as well. So, do we get more complete data from the higher incentive? So basically, the swap happened between the 6-week and the 6-month follow-up time points, and basically, people in either trial arm were then randomized a second time after completing 6-week follow-up, and this randomization had minimization by their response rate at the 6-week follow-up. So that was likely to be predictive of their response rate in 6 months. So we wanted that to be balanced between arms, and also which intervention arm they were in, because that may also influence it. And we had a nice balanced sort of sample who were either randomized to £10 or £20, and then they were offered this by text message at follow-up. One of the nice things about this, something I thought was really neat, was that the only difference, so in the participant information sheet, it only referred to a £10 incentive, and the only difference between these two arms were just whether it said £10 or £20 in the text message. Everything else was exactly the same. So it was quite a clean kind of manipulation. The researcher who did the manual follow-up was blinded to incentive allocation, so they didn't know. And basically the way it worked is that at 6 months follow-up, people got an initial text message where it said the £10 or £20. They had a couple of follow-up reminders, and then 2 weeks later they were telephoned if they still hadn't completed the survey. They would have still got their £10 or £20 if they completed it manually. So it wasn't contingent on them completing it themselves online. And then if we still hadn't heard from them 24 days later, roughly, we'd sent them a text message trying to collect their primary outcome only by text. So sort of reply with your smoking status kind of thing. It was pre-registered on the SWOT repository store. We had a good, as I said, balance between both groups, and they're very similar across those in terms of randomization to either of these two groups. So findings, objective 1, we didn't find a difference between incentive arms in response rate. So for those given £10, 74%, those £20, 79%, and that wasn't a statistically significant difference. However, we did find that there was quite a big difference in terms of the need for manual follow-up between the two groups. So 62% of those in the £10 arm needed a telephone call, i.e. they didn't complete the questionnaire themselves until they were called by a researcher, versus 46% in the £20 arm, and that was statistically significant. Probably because of that need for manual follow-up, we found that people in the £20 arm completed the follow-up survey much quicker, well, 7 days, well, actually 8 days quicker than those in the £10 arm. Again, this was significant, and you can see from this failure plot that at all points, the red line, which is the £20 incentive, is always higher than the £10, the other line. And interestingly, you can actually see the effects of the reminders there by the fact that it all shoots up a bit. So reminders seem to work here, but the £20 were always ahead of £10 in terms of speed of response. And it's likely to be that it was because of the manual follow-up that meant we didn't find an overall difference in our two groups. If we hadn't done manual follow-up, we would have, because we would have got what we had most likely got in terms of those rates we got for the need for manual follow-up. That would have indicated what kind of response rate we'd have got without that manual follow-up. Objective 3, completeness of data. Interesting, we didn't run inference tests because this wasn't something we planned in our pre-specified plan. But if qualitatively looking at the data, then there's certainly an indication that those in the £20 incentive arm had higher rates of completion of data than those in the £10 incentive arm, by not so big for the primary outcome, but for the other kinds of measures that we included, but roughly about 10% difference, which is quite meaningful, I think. Okay, summary of the whole project then that I talked about. So we felt that the automated trial design worked really well. It did take a bit of work to set it up, but it worked beautifully once it was set up, and certainly convinced us that this is a really useful approach for some kinds of trials, particularly of digital interventions. The app had promising uptake and engagement, and it met our pre-specified kind of progression criteria thresholds, and there was certainly a good signal for potential effectiveness as well. The auto process evaluation, not so promising, but worth having done. It wasn't a complete failure, but perhaps sort of going back to the drawing board is needed for that. And we generated some evidence that increasing an incentive from £10 to £20, while not increasing overall response rate for a study where you're doing manual follow-up, it did increase response time and reduce the need to manually follow people up. So that could enhance validity. It may also increase data completeness, which also could increase validity and potentially power as well. As is always the case, the findings of this particular trial might not generalize to other populations or to other online trials. So so it's always worth bearing in mind the context of this. And I think when it comes to online recruitment, that this is something that changes quite quickly and has done over the last 4 years or so when we started this study. Particularly in terms of success of reaching participants online. We're still doing Facebook advertising, but it's not quite as cost effective as it was when we did this study. So that's worth bearing in mind as well. So that's everything from me. Thanks very much for listening, and be interested to hear if anyone has any questions.